The first time I came to Washington from the glorious place that I grew up, which was New Jersey, which, thank you. Everybody has that Jersey envy. We came down, and I don't remember a lot about it, but I do remember that one night we went to dinner at a restaurant called Blackie's Steakhouse. Do any of you remember Blackie's Steakhouse? I may not be the oldest one in the room. It closed, I think, about 14 years ago, something like that. But we went there because my dad said, well, you know, presidents go here, and maybe you'll see somebody. J. Edgar Hoover goes here with his boyfriend. It's really cool. And so, you know, they thought I was going to be mesmerized by that. But what I was really mesmerized by was that there was a teletype machine in the lobby. And it did the wire services, and it just, you know, you could stand in front of it. News stories would come, you know, from everywhere in the world, and I had a pretty dark imagination. And so I kind of thought, well, if I stand in front of this, I will be the first one to know when the Russians attack us, you know. I didn't really recognize that the Russian attack would take a long time to come, and when it did, it would be in the form of tweets and a reality star. But something clicked in me, and I thought, this is the place I want to be. I want to be in Washington. There's so much going on here that's exciting. This is the center of power. And so I did the things that you do to go and become a Washington insider. You know, I went to the right kind of schools, and I studied history and those kind of things. And the very first job I got was as the press secretary to a congressman, a guy named Stephen Solars of Brooklyn, even more glorious than New Jersey, a good guy, and I came down here and I got to know the system a little bit, and then I went back to New York and I worked in media and I worked on Wall Street, all those things that sort of feed the path in Washington. I came back. I was a senior official in the Clinton administration. I was Deputy Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade Policy Development, where I learned that the longer your title, the less power you have in the government. And then for about half a year, I was acting Undersecretary for International Trade. And then I did all those other things that you do if you're going to be in the Washington establishment. I taught at Georgetown. I taught at Columbia. I wrote books. I was the managing director of Kissinger Associates. I founded a consultancy. I then ran Foreign Policy magazine. And so, you know, I was rewarded in the way that you are rewarded when you come here to Washington, and I got my own table at the Four Seasons breakfast restaurant. And so they would say, Mr. Rothkopf, let me show you to your table. And that's kind of as glorious as it got for me here in Washington. Now, of course, now, you know, like everybody else, I have a podcast. There are like 400 of you, and I'm sure there are 300 podcasts. But good luck to you all. The reality, though, is that now, as I look back on it, on a more serious note, having made my way through that, and I came here in 1979, so it's 40 years, I'm ashamed. I'm ashamed to be a member of the Washington establishment. I believe the past 40 years will go down in history as 40 years in which the United States of America lost its way, and in which it was led in this dangerous journey by the Washington establishment. And I don't say that in a partisan way. I was a member of the Clinton administration. I'm a Democrat, but I also worked for Henry Kissinger. I'm I wanted to be a centrist, because I thought everybody would like me because I was a centrist. Who would? As it turns out, everybody hates you because you're a centrist. But the reality is, I think we had it wrong as centrists too. Because what started to happen shortly after I got to Washington is that we lost track of the things that were making America great. We had this vision of ourselves. We came out of World War II. Half of all world trade went through the United States. We were booming. Inequality was falling. Social mobility was rising. 90% of the people born in the 1940s ended up earning more money than their parents. 70% of the people born in that decade ended up having more education than their parents. So there was economic mobility, there was social mobility, income inequality hit lowest levels in history. In 1957 and 1967 particularly, income inequality in the United States was at the lowest level that there was. So there was leadership, there was economic growth, there was prosperity, but it benefited everybody. People at the bottom benefited, people at the top benefited. When there was top-line growth, it passed on in wages. This was the model, and we started to take it for granted. And then in the 1980s, something changed. And in that era, you can call it the onset of corporate capitalism, the onset of Gordon Gekko capitalism. What happened was we started to change in our values. We first changed by looking at different metrics. You know, we said, well, if GDP is going up and the stock market is going up and the bond market is going up and the wealthiest people are getting well, then everybody else will benefit. That was trickle-down economics. Of course, we've subsequently learned it doesn't work. You know, that was a myth. But in pursuing that myth, we started to put into place laws and policies that benefited the few to the expense of the many. We put into place tax cuts that benefited the few at the expense of the many. We passed laws that benefited the few at the expense of the many. And when the Clinton administration came around, you know, we thought, well, you know, we'll fix some of this stuff, but we also said we're going to be centrist and we're going to take the third way. And I have to be honest with you. In retrospect, that third way was a bit of a sellout. Essentially what it was saying we will win by being a little bit like Reagan. We will win by embracing a little bit of Reaganomics. And when you look at it, it wasn't just that we proposed certain kinds of policies. I, for example, was involved in the advocacy of free trade. And as I sit and look back on it now, you know, we said, well, rising tide lifts all boats, without a heck of a lot of evidence that it did, and without any concern for the disruptions that might be caused when that rising tide swamped other boats. You know, when the Clinton administration got elected, we looked at things like welfare reform, and that seemed, you know, sound and sensible, but it was also a dog whistle, wasn't it? Welfare reform was also a way of saying we are going to be a little bit tougher on the poorest and on minorities. And although I don't think that was in the heart of Bill Clinton, I do think that was how we won power. And Bill Clinton also put into place economic officials, Bob Rubin, Larry Summers, other economic officials, who danced essentially to the music of Wall Street. We looked at macroeconomic indicators, we looked at top-line indicators, and we said, well, if the stock market's doing well, the bond market's doing well, the GDP is growing, then things are going to be fine. But we also put into place new laws. There was a decision to allow hedge funds and others to not pay taxes on their carried interest. There was the repeal of the Glass-Steagall provisions, which kept banks from growing too large out of size. And these kinds of things then continued with George W. Bush's administration and Dick Cheney and a bunch of energy cronies setting energy policy, or the military-industrial complex driving us into oil wars. And don't look at military-industrial complex as a kind of a radical term, right? That's an Eisenhower term from 1960. That's not some wacky socialist term. But that's what led us into wars that cost $3 trillion. But some people benefited from those wars. And the tax changes took place and deregulation took place. And the Obama administration came in, and I think the Obama administration may be the most liberal administration of the past 50 years, but Barack Obama took more money from Wall Street than any presidential candidate in history. And when Wall Street reforms were seen after 2009 through Dodd-Frank, they were not implemented. The agencies that needed computers were not even given the computers that they needed. And right now, when you look at it, we're right back in exactly the same situation with bad debt and too big to fail institutions 10 years later. And that's because of things that happened back then. And along the way, there are other kinds of acts that you don't know. In the Reagan administration, there was the elimination of the Fairness Doctrine, which ultimately led us into the world of competing information bubbles that we're in. Or there was the Telecom Act of 1996, which essentially said to dot-com companies, you can be a media company without having the responsibilities of being a media company. And there were laws that were passed or approved by the Congress, or decisions made by the Supreme Court. Citizens United is one that comes to mind, where the Supreme Court essentially said that money is speech. And that meant that you couldn't regulate the amount of money going into politics. Well, who does that benefit? It benefits people with money. It says if money is speech, the people with more money have more speech. And I can go on and on with the list of these things, and I'll be happy to meet you later if you want another hour or two of this. But I'm sure you'll look forward to that. But when you look at them, there are consequences. And the consequences are that the United States economy is broken now. The United States society is broken now. Inequality is at the worst levels since before 1929, before the crash. The top 0.1% of the population, the top 1% of the population make the same percentage of wealth and income that they made before then. 3 people, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, and Jeff Bezos, have a net worth equivalent to the bottom 50% of the population. The top 5% of the population has a net worth equivalent to the bottom 2/3 of the population. And income mobility and educational mobility have fallen, whereas in the 40s, 90% of people thought that they would, and ended up making more than their parents. Now it's 40% or 50%. In the 40s, where something like 70% ended up with a better education than their parents, now it's 40%. The bottom fifth stay in the bottom fifth. When they rank the top 10 economies in the world in terms of income mobility, we, the place of the American dream, ranked at the bottom with the United Kingdom. And by the way, if you are born into the top fifth, you tend to stay in the top fifth. The odds are much better in your favor. In fact, the best indicator of how you will do in getting into a college is your zip code. In other words, it's the place that you are from. And it's worse if you're in a minority. The median net worth of a white family in America is $147,000. The median net worth of a black family in America is $3,500. It's a little more than that for a Latino family, but it's still 1/22nd of what it is for a white family. So if you're black, or you're Latino, or you're poor in general, or you are a woman in our society, you are doing worse, and according to a recent Brookings Institution study, you are stuck. It is not changing. And I have to say, this, we can look at this and we can talk about it like it's the weather, but it's not the weather. It's a choice. It's a choice that all of us are making as a country. It's a choice that the establishment has made in the United States. And they made the choice because it was in their self-interest, because they said, I will get rich doing this, or I will have the money I need to run for office doing this. You can't run for president unless you have $1 billion behind you. Well, you can't get $1 billion unless you've got rich people behind you. And so the money primary is all of a sudden more important than any of the other primaries that take place later on. You know how it works on Capitol Hill with funding. And now you've got, the kind of apotheosis of this, or maybe we would call it the nadir of this, where not only do you have the government working for the 1% with a tax cut for the 1% that didn't benefit anybody else, but you've actually got the president not just working for the 1%, but for himself and for his family. So that he is, selling White House memorabilia, and he is doing deals with countries in terms of foreign policy that he would do deals with in terms of real estate. And you may say, that's anathema to me, that's terrible, but that's 40 years of history. We have been led to this. He is a symptom. He is not a leader. He couldn't conceivably be a leader under any definition of the word. But you have to ask yourself, what do we do about it? And I remember when I went there to Blackie's, we also then went the next day to the National Archive, and I tend to, when I look at things like this, my reaction is, go back to the basics. What's the social contract? Is the social contract in America to make America the wealthiest country in the world, to create wealth? Is that why we've come together as a society? Is that the metric we use? Because the metrics that we use, like GDP, which, by the way, when it was created in the Commerce Department by Kuznets in the 1930s, he said, don't use this as an indicator of economic health, But we all, as a country, we sort of treated that like one of those tags on a mattress. We tore it off. We said, forget that. We're gonna use that. But if you use GDP as a metric, it can be great for corporations, it can be great for rich people, and it can be really bad for everybody else. In fact, there are some incentives for it to be really bad for everybody else. So what's the social contract? And I went and I looked at the Declaration of Independence. There are 22 words in the Declaration of Independence that actually speak to it. It's more of a political document, but of course you know them, and you know that at the end they say, we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Constitution, by the way, also goes all the way up to 22 words devoted to this, but it gives us sort of 5 areas, including the public welfare, tranquility, security, and so forth, that we are coming together to create. Well, that may not be enough. But I found that if you go back a little bit further, back beyond the Declaration, back beyond the Constitution, to the words that inspired them both, of John Locke, who wrote during the Glorious Revolution in England in the 17th century, and he wrote about life, liberty, and property, and there's been a lot of discussion about that. But at the second half of the paragraph in which he wrote about that, he then said, once your own security is taken care of, you then should look after the security of others. Once your own security is taken care of, you then should help those in need, and you should never act in a way that infringes on the health or life and limb or liberty of other people in your society. In other words, the reason we are in this is to help one another. It's not to be the richest. The reason we are in this is to work together as a society to improve the quality of life for everybody. And there are people seeking metrics that are better examples of this, whether it's Bhutan and its gross national happiness, or it's economists like Joe Stiglitz who've been working on this for a while. There are ways to say, yes, we are going to look at how we improve quality of life in the United States, and we are going to take money out of politics, and we are going to tax people in a way that is proportionate to their wealth, and we are going to tax corporations in a way that's proportionate to their health. And you might think, oh my God, socialists, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but of course, the marginal tax rate, when the marginal tax rate was 90%, that was Dwight Eisenhower. That not exactly socialist. And when General Lucius Clay led the US forces in Europe restructuring the German economy, which became one of those wacky socialist economies, it was the US Army that said to the Germans, you must have labor unions on the board of your company. General Lucius Clay did that. So having fair tax rates or having responsive governance systems in businesses is not something that is radical. It's something that's American. It's something that's traditional. It's something that goes back to Eisenhower or General Lucius Clay or Franklin Roosevelt or the Declaration of Independence or John Locke. It's a radical idea in the history of society. But it's not radical in the United States. It's just that we have drifted as a society towards greed and drifted away from purpose. And what I want to say today is enough. My generation, those of you who remember Blackie's Steakhouse, it's time to get off the stage. We have contributed, we can kibitz from the wings, but it is time for new people who recognize the nature of our changing society, who see how technology is changing jobs, who see how technology is changing productivity, and who are not tainted by this broken system to get back to the business that was mandated as our mission in the 17th century and in the 18th century, and when America had a generation we called the greatest generation. Thank you very much.